Hey everybody, today we are going to learn about how to name covalent compounds. In other words, we are going to study the nomenclature or naming of covalent compounds or molecules. Some chemicals have a special name that you simply just have to memorize. For example, H2O will be water. Nothing special there, it's just a unique name. CH4 will be methane, and NH3 is ammonia, so let me write ammonia. So memorizing these three will lead you far in chemistry. So now let's look at the naming system. So if you have a covalent molecule that's composed of only one element, we call those by the name of their elements. Now, what I mean, while we take a look at the diatomic molecules such as Cl2, Cl2 is just the name of the element, chlorine, or even chlorine gas if you want to specify its state. Now, what about N2, which is another diatomic molecule? Well, this is just called nitrogen, and you could add the gas if you'd like. Now, what about Br2? Well, we could call this bromine, or you could even add the state, bromine liquid, if you'd like. So what if you have multiple elements combined together? Well, we have a system for that. To name covalent compounds, just look at the number of atoms of each element and assign the prefixes to each atom. Let's look at an example. Let's take CO2. So C will have one carbon and we will have two oxygens. Now, there is an exception to putting a prefix in front of the element. If your first element has only one atom, then we omit the prefix for that. So in this case, instead of being called monocarbon, as shown right there, we will just call it carbon. And our second element will have two oxygens, so according to the table, it will be di, and then oxide. Now, I forgot to tell you one very important rule. So, for our second element, you will change the ending so that it has an "ide." So, what do I mean by that? Well, dioxygen will become dioxide. So, let's take a look at a list of the element names converted into their "ide" form. So, H is, of course, hydrogen, and it transforms into hydride. Notice how the ogen changed into an "ide" ending. So this applies to all these elements, and here are the most common ones that you should know. But we could do one practice one with an element that's not on this list, and I'll show you how one can convert an element's name into its "ide" form. So let's take selenium. And let's try to convert it into its "ide" form. So let's make it so that it sounds good, because most of these sound good, so we want to make the "ide" form sound good. I don't know why, but it works apparently. So selenium is selenide. That sounds right. It's not selenide. That doesn't sound right. But selenide sounds right. I don't know. Maybe you just get used to them by looking at a lot of them, or you just simply memorize it, which is one way that it could be done. So nitrogen will be nitride. It sounds good on the tongue, and maybe that's why the "ides" are named this way. So now let's go back to this list. So CO2 will be carbon dioxide. And remember, if the first element has only one atom, then we omit the prefix. So let's try a few more. So how do we name CF4? This will be carbon, and we omit the prefix because the first element has only one atom. And our next word will be tetra, because there are 4 fluorines, and from the list 4 will be tetra. So it's going to be tetrafluoride. So we use the "ide" form. Now let's try a few more. What about HCl? And let me put the gaseous form, because when you go into later videos, you'll learn that HCl gas and HCl in its aqueous form are actually 2 different things, and they are named differently. So for our sake, HCl will be a gas, and when it is a gas, we name it using the method I described. So this would simply be hydrogen, and we omit the prefix because there's only one atom of hydrogen for our first element. And our next one will be monochloride. So even though the second element had only one, we use the mono prefix because it is not the first element, it is our second element. So we don't treat it with the same rule as we did with the first element. Now, to tell you the truth, we don't usually call HCl gas hydrogen monochloride. We actually just call it hydrogen chloride, because H and Cl can only form a 1-to-1 ratio. So it's kind of redundant to say hydrogen monochloride when we all know that H and Cl can only form in a 1-to-1 ratio. But technically, hydrogen monochloride is still technically correct. So you could still use this process, but as you do more chemistry, you'll hear hydrogen chloride more often, and eventually you will start calling it hydrogen chloride instead of hydrogen monochloride. But we're not at that stage yet, so call it hydrogen monochloride or hydrogen chloride if you'd like. Let's do one more example. SF6. Oops, that 6 is a little too big. Let's make that a subscript. So this would be sulfur. And remember, we don't use monosulfur because the first element has only one atom, and we don't need to use the prefix. And then our second element will be called hexafluoride. Alright, how about this? Let's do just one more. Let's try something like N2O3. This will be dinitrogen trioxide. So remember, we use this naming system when naming covalent compounds and not ionic compounds or salts. So for example, if I gave you CaCl2, you would not use the naming system that I just taught you. You'd use another naming system which will be taught in the next video. So how can you tell whether to use this naming system or not? Well, if you have 2 nonmetals like N and O, you could usually use this naming system. But if you have a salt with a metal and a nonmetal, we definitely cannot use the naming system to name this, because there's a different system for that. And naming salts will be covered in the next video, so I hope you learned a lot, and ciao!